But Jim, a big story that unfortunately is unfolding as we are recording right now is the reports, and it's been reported by various members of the press as well as now friends and family, that Scott Hall is currently on life support. I believe the story is he suffered 3 heart attacks as part of a complication after a hip surgery.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, it does not appear that, as of recording time, it doesn't appear that they are expecting a good result here, but at a minimum, Jim, as we are recording, Scott Hall is on life support. What are your thoughts about this?
Well, Kevin Nash reported, he's not a journalist, but he posted, and obviously they've been friends for so long, but he posted that they're waiting for Scott's family to all assemble before taking him off life support, and that's not because he won't need it anymore, but just there's nothing else apparently they can do. That might change, so we don't know, but he had the heart attacks based on what I read from a blood clot breaking loose from his recent hip surgery, because I guess and I mean, this sounds like the cliche, 85-year-old woman living at home alone falls and breaks her hip, and that's the beginning of the end, right? But he fell and broke his hip a few weeks ago and had to have surgery on it. And that surgery led to the blood clot that led to breaking loose, led to the heart attacks, and et cetera. I mean, it's not a good thing. It's not a good thing no matter how you look at it, but several people had mentioned that everybody that was close to Scott Hall 10 years ago when they did that, was it ESPN did the documentary? They thought he was going to die pretty soon then because of the condition he was in. And a lot of people were saying, okay, this is not going to end well. And I guess one of the articles I read said his son Cody was in that documentary saying, hey, I just want to see my dad get better and et cetera. And I guess through numerous twists and turns, he's been in and out of a lot of rehabs, and the thing with Dallas Page. But finally, I don't know. He's not in my social circle, but I guess over the last few years, he has straightened up somewhat. But now the health issues that he's been saddled with as a result of the life he led for years before that has just started taking its toll on him. But I have not heard that he's had major issues recently, or have you?
I had not heard too much about his health recently, no.
Yeah, so I think issues with his, addiction issues.
Right.
I think he's...
Yeah.
It's not like that this is something that's ongoing. It's just that now all those years of wrestling, all those years of steroids, all those years of the recreational drugs that he's, admitted to. And what was it he said on one of the shows that he and Michaels used to sit there and say, hey, are you still alive? Give me another pill. So this is all, coming to bear at all the same time on him. He's only 63. And, he looks a lot older because of everything he's been through. But, it's a shame. He was a pivotal part in wrestling history with the Attitude Era when he and Nash went to WCW. And I know they like to say they changed wrestling for, the way guys are paid and no, they changed it all right, specifically for themselves. And if other people benefited, that was a byproduct, but they really changed the business because that's what kicked off the Attitude Era and Vince's response and the whole, 9 yards. And it was hot-shotted, and it was the Attitude Era didn't have to end when it did. It was hot-shotted so much by the people that didn't know what had started it. Shitstain, he thought that his writing did it, and Vince thought that his attitude had done it. They gave the people something that they believed for the first time in the 90s, at least in wrestling. At the start of the 90s, WWF was cartoon land. WCW was a non-entity. It was a great product that nobody was watching because the company was so mismanaged. And then they fell in a hole, and Vince had everything unobstructed for 6 years. And then Hall and Nash show up. First Hall, then Nash show up on WCW television. And because it was only the infancy of the internet, and people weren't as smart, and they didn't know everything that was going on, especially ahead of time, they thought that finally these two companies are going to fight. The WWF guys have invaded WCW. Shit's on. That's what kicked that off. And it was Hall and Nash because they could talk, because they looked good, because they were big, because they were fearsome and heels, and they didn't give a shit whether anybody liked them or not. That's what made that. And that's why Hogan wanted to become part of it, because he wanted to sap the over off of what Hall and Nash had started. He saw how hot it was going to be. But an invasion that wasn't really an invasion, but that was the first thing in wrestling that entire decade that the fans had been able to believe. And since they were able to come right straight hot off television, off Vince's television, with no warning, no burials, no nothing, it made it look like it was an invasion. And that's what kicked off the Attitude Era. So you can't take that away from either Hall or Nash. And Scott Hall, honestly, was probably the best worker of the original bunch. Helmsley was still green. Nash never was a great worker physically in the ring. Michaels was obviously a preeminent worker, but, Hall had it. He was more of and even JR said, hey, he's got a great wrestling mind. I think Hall was one of those guys where he kind of became who he was hanging around with. Of all of those guys, I probably had the longer conversations with Scott Hall and still didn't have very many because we were always in different social circles. But Hall got the wrestling business and had the ability to work and still had size and could talk, and he got the Razor Ramon gimmick over. It was one of Vince's. Vince saw Scarface, and Vince had him watch the first year of Razor Ramon, had him tricked out like a complete gimmick. But Hall was smart enough and took enough of it into himself that he was able to make that gimmick something rather than just like the Tony D'Angelo thing now and just a complete parody of an Italian or a Cuban or whatever. He made so much of it himself that then when he had to drop it, there was a lawsuit over, him trying to be, or him being Razor Ramon when he was Scott Hall, but it was so much of it was him. It was his mannerisms, and they had to start writing down what things he could and couldn't say as Scott Hall to not be Razor Ramon. It was that because he did what you do. You take a gimmick and you make it you as much as you can. So then when he dropped it and became Scott Hall in WCW, he could still say a lot of the same than the toothpick and the whole 9 yards. It looked like him anyway. But do you remember, Brian, the American Starship?
That was him and Dan Spivey. What was it? Coyote and
Eagle.
Coyote and Eagle.
And I'm trying to think which was which. I think was Scott Hall Coyote? I think he was.
Yeah, he looks more like a coyote.
Dusty had them under a personal services contract. Did you know that?
I don't think I did.
That was the story, at least that I heard when we first started working for Crockett. That's when Spivey and Scott Hall were there as the American Starship. And Dusty had found both of them, I believe, in Florida, and brought them up there. And he thought that they would be, because of their height and their size. And back of Scott Hall was a great looking guy. He looked like another guy that looked like Tom Selleck. And Spivey back then didn't look as bad as he would later, but they were big and they were impressive looking. And Dusty thought that they would be a modern, day super babyface tag team, American Starship, Eagle and Coyote. You can tell that was his name. That was Dusty's gimmick. The American Starship, baby. You can hear him saying it. And he wanted to push him, but Hall was green, Spivey was Spivey, and it was an underneath kind of team. He didn't push him to the moon. And I remember, I don't even know if at that point, if we ever worked with him as a team, or we worked with Spivey a couple times. I think Hall left first and went to work for Vern. And Spivey was hanging around, so we'd work against the Italian Stallion and Starship Eagle or whatever. And just, but that Dusty had them under contract and intended to do something with him because he saw something in them. You could see it with Hall even then. And then when he went in the AWA, because they had, let's face it, by that point, a smaller talent roster, less top guys, less veterans, etc. There was more room for him to grow there. What was the gimmick they brought him into WCW in was it 90 or 91? Was it right before I left or right after I left?
Well, he came in 89, the summer of 89, as an alligator hunter of some sort. And then he came back in 91 as the Diamond Stud.
That's the Diamond Stud. Yeah, I remember the alligator hunter briefly. That may have been, was that right after they got rid of George Scott and had the booking committee and everybody was throwing ideas in? Yeah, and that didn't last very long and it shouldn't have. I don't think, because
he's in the Battle Royal for Great American Bash 89, the pay-per-view.
Yeah. And then the Diamond Stud was affiliated with Diamond Dallas Page, and that was kind of a precursor to Razor Ramon, at least with the hair curl or whatever. But he really never got, he was getting experience at that point, but he really never got both a spot and a gimmick and a push at the same time until, a gimmick that was worth anything, until Razor Ramon. And then he took it and ran with it. And then the Outsiders. And at that point, really think about this. After that initial run and then whatever they did to clean up the mess after Vince bought WCW, did Scott ever have another really regular run after that? Or was it just coming back every so often as the NWO revivals and things like that?
I think it's kind of that. Even that, when they first did that, when they brought Hogan back to wrestle Rock, and remember, they gave Scott Hall to Steve Austin because Steve Austin didn't want to wrestle Hogan.
Yeah.
I don't think Scott Hall lasted too much longer after that. Kevin Nash, I think, stayed, and Scott Hall was gone.
But think about it, 20 years ago, he was 43 20 years ago. Because we forget that he started late. He was in his late 20s when he broke into business, right? Because he's 3 years older than me and he started after. So, that was pretty much his window to be a full-time guy. But as a result of the over of Hall and Nash and the NWO and the whole 9 yards, he's been able to go back and forth and do the reunions and et cetera off of that since then. But like I say, I never had a long conversation with the guy because I was either never around him, or then by the time I was, we were always in different social circles. Think about, obviously just early on in the 80s, hey, how are you? Pass in the night. By the time that I went to the WWF, he was in WCW, it was just in and out. And then came in 91, I was already gone. 93, I went in, he was Razor. Cool. Yeah, we worked some with Yoko, blah, 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 whatever, as I recall. But then, because I was only going in and out for the TVs and the pay-per-views and running Smoky Mountain. But by the time I started spending more time up there, the clique was together. And Hall and Nash and whoever was in their car were always fucking with all my friends. Tammys and Candidos and the regular normal guys. And so it wasn't adversarial necessarily. And then the curtain call, and then I wrote all of them off as people that I would ever want to be friends with. But, at the same time, he's a big name talent that, got over to a level and was involved got over to a level that most people don't, and was involved in the single biggest turning point in modern wrestling history. So out of all of them, he's probably the nicest guy. Like I said, I think he just took on the personality of those people that was around him. But, I wish now maybe we had a talk or two, that if he hadn't done the curtain call and hadn't pissed all my friends off and shit in their lunch boxes or whatever, we might have been friends.
Certainly a very talented guy and one of the better big guys of his era, because he wasn't, he was a big guy. He was, 6'5", 6'6"?
Yeah, and see, that's the thing, because he's tall and his body's proportionate. A guy like that's, 6'6" and weighs 270 sometimes doesn't look as big as he is on TV until you get up next to him. And he could move for a fucking guy that size. And, that's, who was it? Jesus Christ. Somebody just tweeted this. Somebody's was doing his Razor's Edge, but did it as turned it into a power bomb and dropped this guy right on the back of his head. And you saw his head bounce off the canvas. And Lance Storm had tweeted saying, well, that's a concussion. And other people, hey, you didn't have any problem with Razor Ramon doing it. And then I think I tweeted back. I said, well, look at the difference. You fucking idiots. Ramon, he knew how to pick a guy up and set him down. That's what I'm saying. Everybody else just imitates other people's moves. Hall knew how to work. Therefore, he could do some of these things. And, I don't remember any problems with him hurting anybody. And I don't remember actually any problems with him having any major injuries either. It was always the substances that were Scott's own worst enemy. And for an athlete like that, maybe this is a caution. A guy that was in that kind of shape, that looked like that was a high-level athlete for a long period of time, and look at the shape he's been in for the last 10 years or more and what's going on now. That's something that maybe a lot of other people, maybe not in the wrestling business these days, they're addicted to video games now, but just people in life. If it can do that to him, what's it doing to you? And you look like a schlub to begin with.